Hello, I am Dave Armstrong, 10th President of St. Thomas University. Welcome to STU. In 2013, member states of the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution designating today, July 30th, as the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. The resolution stated that the day was necessary to raise awareness of the situations of victims of human trafficking and for the promotion and protection of their rights. Here at STU, our education mission in the Catholic intellectual tradition thoroughly focuses on both issues: combating human trafficking and defending human rights. We do this through two world-renowned programs: the LLM-JSD program in Intercultural Human Rights and the John J. Brunetti Human Trafficking Academy. I thank you all for joining us today. We offer a special thank you to two of our Academy's long-standing partners over the years. First, the International Rescue Committee, a leader in assisting unaccompanied minors in the United States. The IRC has a well-known history of helping people throughout the world whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and regain control of their future. Secondly, the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, of which we are founding members. As many of you know, the task force is federally funded by the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime and the Bureau of Justice Assistance through the enhanced collaborative partnership between Miami-Dade Police Department and International Rescue Committee. The task force works in partnership with the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and Homeland Security Investigations in Miami. The task force is currently composed of over 400 members from various sectors in the Tri-County area, and especially I want to thank Professor Rosa Patti, the founder and director of the John J. Brunetti Human Trafficking Academy, who initiated this event in cooperation with our LLM and Human Rights alumna and current president of the task force, Ms. Caridad Mas Bachelor, as well as with Ms. Florencia Dominguez of International Rescue Committee and Mr. Cristobal Perez of the Department of Children and Families Refugee Services Program. The STU Human Rights Program and its Human Trafficking Academy are prolific leaders in addressing cutting-edge issues that surround the protection of human rights and combat human trafficking in all dimensions. Since 2004, our Human Rights Program has hosted numerous symposia, seminars, and roundtables locally, nationally, and throughout the world. More specifically, related to the event today, the Academy has monitored the intersections of human trafficking and the challenges of unaccompanied minors and designed today's program based on the events we are experiencing on a state and national level. After an influx of unaccompanied minors into the United States, the Office of Refugee Resettlement faced a historic number of referrals with over 20,000 children in care this past May. Today, our distinguished panelists will share their perspectives and firsthand accounts of the challenges surrounding unaccompanied minors as it relates to human trafficking. They will discuss the current situation and legal landscape regarding unaccompanied minors in the United States and how at times their vulnerabilities are exploited into human trafficking, from identification at the border, reunification with parents, or placement with sponsors, cultural and linguistic challenges, barriers to receiving assistance, how we as a community can help, and more. In these last months, the federal government has placed thousands of unaccompanied minors with sponsors in Florida, and many of them are in our own neighborhoods. They will need shelter, schooling, and protections from exploitation of every kind, including human trafficking. We at the John J. Brunetti Human Trafficking Academy and St. Thomas University remain committed to upholding and advancing the inherent value, worth, and dignity of each human being, including these unaccompanied minors that have entered our great country in hopes of better lives, and with the blessings of the freedoms we hold dear. As Pope Francis said, quote, "Let's ensure that these vulnerable children and adolescents who are fragile and defenseless do not lack necessary care and preferential humanitarian channels," end quote. Again, I welcome you all to St. Thomas University, wish you a fruitful discussion, and as we say here, God bless and go Bobcats.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are located, situated. We have a few hundred registrants to this panel discussion today from 14 countries around the world, from all continents but for Australia, and from over 30 countries in 30 states in the United States. So I welcome you all, and I am very much grateful of the work that you do in the trenches, working with migrants, refugees, and specifically with unaccompanied minors. I am grateful to President Armstrong for taking the time, though he had another commitment at exactly this time, but he took the time and effort to give a welcome to you all and to lay out the problem that we will be discussing today. And of course, who better but the representatives of the organizations that we have invited today, the ones that are at the forefront of addressing the issue of unaccompanied minors. As you already know, there are quite a large number of unaccompanied minors that have entered the United States, but so many more that have crossed the borders in many parts of the world, in almost every country of the world. And of course, it is incumbent upon the governments of each country, including the United States, and legally obligated to make sure that these children are taken care of until they reach adulthood. But of course, it's not always easy to do that. Immigration systems are not always the perfect ones. There are lots of challenges ahead. And in order to address these challenges for the very best interest of the child, to take care of the situation that we are here today, as a matter of law, as a matter of obligation, as a matter of domestic and international law, these children are here and we are obliged to take care of them. And of course, we have to work together and to cooperate internally, but also with other countries. Because, as an old African proverb would say, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, we all go together. So, I am delighted to have with us today some great experts. Let me start with their names, and I know you have already read their bios. We have them all placed on our website if you want to check them further, and we are also very happy to get you in contact with them should you want to cooperate and network with them later. Let me start with my colleague, Ana Isabel Vallejo of Vida Legal Assistance. She's an attorney that has been working in anti-trafficking work since the very early 2000s, one of the pioneers in the state of Florida. And actually, she was the first coordinator when I started the Human Trafficking Academy. She's the present co-director of Vida Legal Assistance, and they do an extraordinary work in South Florida and beyond, internationally well known as well. Miss Cinia Bermudez comes from Catholic Legal Services, a pillar in South Florida community. The extraordinary work of Catholic Legal Services never goes unnoticed. And we are absolutely delighted to have Ms. Bermudez here with us, who has a wealth of expertise working out in the trenches. Let me move on to Ms. Caroline Chisholm of the IRC. I don't think that there is anyone that does work in the field of human rights, refugees, and migrants that doesn't know the IRC worldwide. I once worked for IRC back in the Balkans during the Kosovo War. I have but the greatest respect for IRC and for everyone that works for them. And today we have Caroline Chisholm, who is a caseworker. So she really has a hands-on experience. We are delighted to have Caroline with us today. Last but not least, as always, we have a survivor with us that will guide us, help us, enlighten us to do the work best we can. And the Honorable Piraino-Guzman is here with us today. A great professional in the field, extraordinary experience in working with migrants and minors, and also a former member of the US Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. I welcome you all to St. Thomas Law School Human Trafficking Academy, and I am blessed to have you in this panel today. And as I am absolutely sure that our audience will very much appreciate your experience, expertise sharing with us. Thank you and welcome. And we have quite a number of questions that we hope to ask our great panelists, and hope we'll have enough time to discuss the so many issues. Now, the truth is, we are not having a goal today to solve the problem. We know we can't do that. We might not even have globally a really good, effective solution that is coming at hand soon, but that does not prevent us from discussing the issues. So let us start. The first one to address the question to would be Ms. Bermudez. And I would like to ask you, Ms. Bermudez, if you could please explain for us all and for the audience the legal notion of unaccompanied minors. Of course, we know it, but we come from various professional backgrounds and so on. But is there a clear concept in practice? What constitutes an unaccompanied minor? And are there any issues that might interfere with blurring the constitutive elements of this notion?
Of course. Thank you for having me today. So I think the basic understanding of what an unaccompanied child is, according to U.S. law, is a child who comes into the U.S. without any lawful immigration status, is a minor, or say under 18 years of age, and technically that there is no parent or legal guardian in the United States to take care of them, or that's available to care for them or take physical custody of them. There's special protections in place for unaccompanied minors, particularly as most of them come through the southern border of the United States and Mexico. There was a settlement agreement a number of years ago, I should say at this point, in which they are only allowed to be in immigration custody for 72 hours. When we say immigration custody, we're talking about Customs and Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then they are required to then move into the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, as President Armstrong was mentioning, ORR, which is housed in the Department of Health and Human Services in the US government. There's a little bit of a blurry situation in that sense, because there's shelters, but there's also sort of emergency shelters in which, some are licensed facilities, some are emergency tents that have been notoriously shown on the media and the whatnot. But even in those emergency shelters, they're not allowed to be there for more than 20 days per the Flores Settlement Agreement. Another protection that is afforded to unaccompanied minors here in the United States is that they're protected from expedited removal. It's recently been in the news again, the concept of expedited removal, in which people are allowed to be deported back to their home country if they don't immediately express a fear of returning to their home country. Children are protected from that. So even if they don't express an immediate fear of returning, they are prohibited from being expeditiously removed to the US. And there's an asterisk on that for Mexican children. Mexican children are allowed to be brought back to Mexico. Let's see, there's also, while they're in ORR custody, a vetting process for sponsors who want to take custody of the child. Typically, when a child crosses the border, they usually have the phone number, name, address of either parent or a family member here in the States that can take care of them. They were usually equipped, it's either in their backpack or on their hands, etc. These sponsors, whether it be family members or their parents or legal custodians, what have you, are then vetted by ORR to make sure that they're not placed in vulnerable situations in which, they are placed in, God forbid, the house of a criminal or a child molester, or prevented from being trafficked. So that's sort of the basic of what's supposed to happen. There is a lot of blurry lines there. For example, there is a lot of unaccompanied minors are classified or categorized as unaccompanied minors, but they do have a parent here in the US. So technically they don't fall into the strict definition of an unaccompanied minor. There is also self-separation and forced separation, which then classify children as unaccompanied minors. For example, Title 42 is still in place at the southern border. So a lot of families prior to families being allowed in would send their child because children weren't being expelled under Title 42. And so the parent would stay in Mexico and send the child, therefore forcing the child to be classified as an unaccompanied minor. During the zero tolerance policy a few years ago, they would separate the parent and the child was then classified as a unaccompanied minor, even though there was obviously a parent here in the States. So there is a lot of blurry lines as to what there's a legal definition, but not a strict practice in place as to how ORR and immigration officials in general classify an unaccompanied minor here in the States.
Thank you, Ms. Bermudez. Really, this was very clear and very precise for us all. Much appreciated your answer. Let me move on to Mr. Piraino-Guzman. So all of these large numbers of children that cross borders unaccompanied are coming here because there are reasons for that, correct? Can you just address some of these reasons, some of the root causes? So many of these children are coming across the US border, but also across the other borders throughout the world and coming unaccompanied.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you all for the opportunity. I'd just like to identify myself as I'm a survivor of human trafficking, but I am also I was a former unaccompanied minor in 2004. When I was taken out of my situation, I was put in the system. In thinking of the root causes of what really drives children to take such a dangerous, hazardous, and journey to the United States is often the seeking of safety that there hasn't particularly been acknowledged in this country yet as why these children. We see often we think of children coming to the United States, try to be with their parents, try to get out here for something else. But it's often if we start peeling the layers of, if we start asking the right questions at the border of these children, if we have professionals and professional folks trained on trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing within the immigration system, we will find these children not only to have experienced civil rights violations in their home countries, but we'll also find that these children may have experienced or perhaps what we call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, that often are the root causes or the basis that put children at risk to human trafficking in this country. So we really, I think that one of the biggest issues that I have seen over the last 2 years is that we have, just the whole system is based on incarcerating people right off the bat, rather actually doing the work to identify the needs of that person and why that person, a young person, that children is here in the United States to seek safety. Being from Honduras, being born in Central America, there are so many other cultural, societal challenges that impact children in our home country. Not only in Honduras, the mortality rate is big. We're talking about one of the most dangerous countries in the world. I was born in San Pedro Sula. There is a saying in my city, entran los que quieren y salen los que pueden. Everybody can enter, but only those who can leave, they actually can leave, because it is so very dangerous. And these are often, I think of the parents. Yes, parents have asked children to come here, but it isn't for a reason other than actually to get those children to safety. During the last 3 years, my brother, for example, my biological brother from my mom, he had to make that trip up here as a child, as a young person, and it was really difficult. I didn't know that he had made the trip because my mother had been experiencing other challenges, and then my brother had to make that trip out here by himself through being 16 years old, through a smuggler, trying to get through safety because of conditions around with gangs and other groups in Honduras that traditionally push children into being part of something that we don't want to, and this is something that we need to stop seeing. Perhaps we need to start thinking about children as people seeking safety rather than as people, as immigrants coming to this country. I personally think that Reno versus Flores is a great was a great start, but we need to evolve the way that people, even the way that the reasons why I came to the United States in 2004 seeking safety are totally different than the reasons of why children are coming here. The safety concerns are a lot larger. The ways children are being harmed by violence, by gangs, by other societal challenges in Central America that really forces children to become the breadwinners for families. Often, I was the oldest one of my family, and I had to provide for my family. I'm still providing for my family back home. So we have to also understand that there is a cultural aspect to these that is really ingrained into our brains, that we really must and contribute and uplift our families. And often that drives us to seek that safety so then we can find safety for our families. We often, and I don't want to use this term because it was used and totally wrong, but when we're thinking about anchors, sometimes these children are the anchors to safety for their families, for their own and for others. So the reasons are many, but the root causes are really the societal, cultural challenges, safety issues that we need to see. We need to see children as people seeking safety and protection rather than people crossing the border. It's a whole, we'll say, structural change that needs to happen in order for us to actually address the root causes and start working with those. Thanks, Patty. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's really very interesting. I wish we had more time to really listen to all the various elements, dimensions of the root causes, but you did spotlight quite important ones, particularly safety, cultural, and economic ones. Let me move on to Ms. Chisholm. Caroline, you are working in the field as a caseworker with these children, basically. Can you share with us a little bit, what are the risks that these children take when they are leaving their country of origin, moving on through transit countries and ending up at the destination country like the United States or any destination country for that matter?
Certainly. Thank you so much. I think if we're thinking about the journey, there are risks associated with the coyotes or the guides that are leading these children. They're paid large sums of money up front, sometimes as much as $10,000 US dollars. And it is really up to their discretion that they arrive safely, which obviously can make an unaccompanied child particularly vulnerable during this difficult journey. I have worked with minors that have been led or turned in by their guides in Mexico or even in the United States to informal detention centers or to other individuals where they have been forced to pay additional amounts of money in order to be released. I have worked with minors who also at a certain point, if the journey becomes more difficult or if there are unforeseen sort of circumstances that the guides will also say, in order to continue, you have to pay additional sums of money as well. So they really are at the whim of these individuals who sometimes, they may not know. So that obviously leaves them at risk for exploitation. And I tend to see slightly more so now, or perhaps in recent months, more minors that are leaving without the assistance of a guide, or maybe who are traveling alone, which also leaves them in a position where they are taking the advice of individuals as they go, asking the next person which bus they need to take or where they need to go. And for some that have left either without sufficient funds or without the support of family members who are forced to work as part of the journey. So they'll spend several months within one of these countries of transit and work in order to be able to afford the next part of the trip. So I've spoken with many minors that have had that experience as well, which obviously can also leave them incredibly vulnerable to types of exploitation and labor trafficking as well. If we're thinking, after arriving and thinking about being in the United States, I think the existence of a travel debt, so the amount of money that a family has paid in order to assist a minor in arriving to the United States, really can make them vulnerable to fall victim to labor trafficking. I think that amount of money and potentially the terms for those payments can be really stringent and potentially have really severe consequences for children and also for their families. I had a client who had a travel debt of $10,000, and her mother was in Guatemala and at risk of losing her home and her land if they were not able to make payments, which puts her in a very difficult position. As unaccompanied children, they don't technically have work authorization when they arrive, which I think means that a lot of unaccompanied children who do make the decision to work are, looking for jobs that don't have written contracts. They're looking for jobs that are in isolation because they want to be away from prying eyes that potentially would, negatively impact their immigration case. Which are obviously, additional risk factors for labor trafficking, particularly in agriculture and domestic servitude, I think, as well. So those are, some of the instances that I've seen and types of exploitation and risks, I think, associated with both the journey and then after arrival as well.
Thank you, Ms. Chisholm. We'll come back to you, but you brought up a very important issue, the issue of smuggling. You refer to the individuals that are paid these large amounts of money and the risk that because of this large debt, it can turn into a debt bondage. So we come then to this intersection of human smuggling and human trafficking. So I would have a question then for Ms. Vallejo as it relates particularly to this issue. Can you just let us know a little bit, what would be the intersection, Anna, between human smuggling and human trafficking? And in your experience, have you come across such cases, and even recently for that matter? I know that you must have come through such cases in such a long experience you have, but have you seen anything recently, and particularly with minors too?
The line, I think, when you're talking about unaccompanied minors, the line between being a victim of smuggling or being smuggled into the United States and the line of when you are trafficked and where you are exploited is really blurry. I think with children, it's a lot blurrier than when you're talking with adults. The reality that the children face, you already heard a little bit, but these children, especially those that are crossing through Mexico and through maybe 3 or 4 countries, as they get here in their journey, they are experiencing a level of violence throughout the process of being smuggled that is very high. They're experiencing, so there might be victims of crimes, not only in their home countries, which makes them already vulnerable, but also they're experiencing other crimes that are happening throughout the process of being smuggled into the United States. Does that mean that they're victims of trafficking? No. For the United States, for them to be, they may be victims of trafficking in those other countries, right? But not necessarily victims of trafficking here in the United States. So for a minor to have or be considered a victim of trafficking, you still have to have the elements of force, fraud, and coercion for the purposes of forced labor, or be forced or induced to provide sexual services in commercial sex, and be under the age of 18. So there's no need for force, fraud, and coercion for somebody who is under the age of 18 who's being exploited in a commercial sexual endeavor or situation, but you still do need to prove force, fraud, and coercion for the purposes of labor services or of extolling labor services of that child in the labor context. So then you have to look at all of the other elements or situations in which this child might be exploited, right? So if I have to work to pay a debt, right? And I know that I have to work to pay a debt, we have to take into account our labor laws or child labor laws. How old is it appropriate for a child to be working, and what are those hours that the child is working, and can the child go and work somewhere else? Now, if you're talking of right there, we have an issue, right? Because if you're under, I believe it's under 16, it's at least in the state, it varies state by state, right? And it also varies in the context of what industry you're working in. So if you're under the age of 16, in Florida, there's a certain number of hours that you can work, and I believe you can't work more than 20 hours a week. And there's a certain amount of, there's a time in the day where you cannot work anymore because you're considered a child. If you have somebody under the age of 16 working and not going to school, are they working in an agricultural environment? And in agriculture, the age limit is lower. So then you really have to start teasing out all of those factors. And I'll give you an example. We had a client who was brought into the United States, and she ends up working in the fields. She's 14, and she says, I have to work to pay my debt, and I can't leave this farm until I pay my debt. So then you start seeing those elements. Because she's 14, because she's seen other violence before, because she's experienced also violence herself, you could make an argument that this is a child who is a victim of human trafficking. She was afraid to leave her place of employment. She couldn't leave her place of employment until that debt was paid. Usually that debt starts incrementing, not just when you cross the border, but then also when you are living in the place where you work. There's also money being deducted from your pay. And then you start seeing that plan, scheme, or pattern that is intended to keep that child in a situation of forced labor.
Thank you, Anna. I know that every time the discussion is about smuggling and human trafficking, the line sometimes can be blurred. And of course, it would also, as an attorney, particularly you, would also go into the technicalities of the law. And I think it was very of interest that you brought about the distinction in the statute between forced labor and commercial sexual exploitation of children, particularly when it comes to means, and the issue that for the commercial sexual exploitation, the age limit of 18 would outweigh the means, or there is not even need for the means actually at all. And in labor, we still have to prove the means. Since we are in the legal field, let me go back to the other attorney we have in the panel here. Ms. Bermudez, I know that you, in the answering the first question, you did go into a few issues that have to do with legal landscape in the United States, but is there anything else that you might like to add about the current situation and the legal landscape currently as it relates to unaccompanied minors?
Of course. So President Armstrong talked a little bit about the statistics in terms of we've seen a huge surge in unaccompanied children across the border in the past fiscal year. I know in my office, we've seen, despite COVID, we've seen about 500 more kids, and we're a tiny office in South Florida. So that's just a tiny reflection of the big number that we've seen across. And there's still continues to be an issue of the fact that when children cross the border, they still don't have access to a government appointed attorney, even though they're children in immigration court. There's no one that is guaranteed to represent them, whether they are eligible for asylum or a T visa, a trafficking visa, or a special immigrant juvenile status. They need to find a pro bono attorney or pay a private attorney to represent them in those complicated petitions. Somebody mentioned about the fact that, they don't have employment authorization. A lot of kids that we help are eligible for the special immigrant juvenile status visa, which are for children who are abandoned, abused, or neglected by one or both of their parents. And these children are stuck in a backlog, which I'll talk about a little bit in later on in the panel. But they're stuck in this backlog, and for years they are not eligible to apply for a work permit. So they're also super vulnerable in, trying to find a job that will help them pay their bills, help them support their families, and oftentimes minimum wage payments that they get because they can't apply for employment authorization. Kids who are currently applying for asylum, or unaccompanied minors, I should say, that are currently applying for asylum, do have the ability, and even though they're in immigration removal proceedings at the immigration court, they have, as I mentioned, special protections in which they can apply for asylum at the asylum office, which gives them a little bit of a more friendlier environment to present their asylum case, as opposed to the adversarial position that they're placed in immigration court. If they're ultimately, and it also gives them sort of two bites at the apple, in which if they are denied at the asylum office, they can then try to fight their case in court again. So they have 2 days in court to say that. Thankfully, there has been a lot of advocacy in South Florida, at the very least, for ORR shelters that are licensed by the state of Florida. There was a lot of outrage several years ago with one of these South Florida shelters that was run by a for-profit company, and it has since been shut down. And there are a lot more ORR shelters that are licensed by the state of Florida, where these children can be safe and or be safer and smaller capacity wise. And as I touched on earlier as well, the Florida Settlement Agreement, although I agree that it doesn't go far enough, it is still thankfully in place as of right now to help protect minor unaccompanied children who come in. So there is a lot going on in the realm, but there's still a lot to do, and these children really need our help.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very useful information that you provided, particularly for those that are working in the area. And I want to remind participants that should you have an interest in communicating with our speakers later, I'm sure that there is so much more that can be said. We are very happy to put you in touch with them. Let me just go back to the attorney here that started talking earlier about smuggling and trafficking, and then the intersection. Anna, can you just, for the purposes of the US federal law, you started the conversation, but then let me just get back to that with you. From the perspective of the TVPA, when would an unaccompanied minor run under the definition, if you will, of a human trafficking victim? Because particularly when it comes to labor, and all of these examples that I am hearing, whether from Ms. Chisholm or Ms. Bermudez, and you as well mentioned it earlier, how quite some of these children, and Mr. Piraino-Guzman as well mentioned earlier, quite a number of these children basically are providing for the family and for themselves and so on, ending up in labor. Can you clarify that? Unmute.
Yeah, so we go back to that definition that I mentioned, right? So somebody who is being exploited in commercial sex, or in exotic dancing, or any kind of that kind of sexual industry, or a child is being forced to provide sex in exchange for anything of value, which is exactly what the statute says, is considered a victim of human trafficking, and there's no need to show force, fraud, or coercion. And So for example, it could be a minor who, and being induced into providing commercial sex is also considered the person induced is also a victim of human trafficking. So they don't need to be acting with a pimp. It could be that there could be homeless and somebody picks them up and offers housing, and they say, well, if you want to stay here, you have to engage in sexual services for me. You could make an argument that that child is a victim of human trafficking. They're being forced to provide, or they're being induced to provide sexual services in exchange for housing. So that I'm just trying to break down a little bit of how this, in practicality, how does it show up? The other part, and the one that is a little bit harder for everybody, is the labor trafficking, because the government needs to be able to show force, fraud, and coercion for purposes of prosecuting a case, right? Force, fraud, and coercion, and again, the purpose has to be exploitation or forced labor. And there's the coercion involves the threats of physical violence, but also the threats of violence in the home country, or threats of deportation, or withholding passport, increasing debt. So you're going to look at what the entire context in which that child is working to make the argument that this child is trafficked. Now, I want to also bring another distinction, which is in the context of immigration law, a victim of severe form of trafficking who's a child does not need to cooperate with law enforcement, and there doesn't need to be an investigation or prosecution of a case. So although you still have to show force, fraud, and coercion if you're a victim of labor trafficking for the purposes of being forced into labor, you don't have to, as a minor, file a complaint. And you don't have to show that you're collaborating with law enforcement, but you do have to show all the other things.
Thank you, Anna. Have you seen, I mean, what kind of, say, examples have you seen that could just more concretely show us how can the government prove this force, fraud, or coercion when it comes to labor, child labor? And again, I come back to this issue because since we have some international participants as well, and there is quite a lot of discussion out there that really there shouldn't even be a distinction in the statute, either when it comes to child labor, whether for whatever, and child commercial sexual exploitation. But and I see some nodding here as well. But can you give us any of the examples? Because it seems like sometimes it could be really hard to prove this force, fraud, or coercion when it comes to children. And what is the issue of consent?
Yes, and for when you see, I've worked with a lot of cases in which a prosecution has not moved forward in child labor context. Because the elements might not be there, because of the jury pool that the prosecutor may be facing, which changes between areas where you're in. But one thing that was always taken into consideration by any prosecutor is the age of the child, the actual context in which they have been working or living, what kinds of experiences they have had. So before I go into an example, I'll give you an example of a case that did not get prosecuted, but was indeed investigated. I had a child. He was smuggled into the United States. In Texas, he was forced to provide sex services, and then ended up in Florida. When he was smuggled into the country, he was not detected by Department of Homeland Security. So there was no screening or any kind of contact with law enforcement that could lead to an identification at that point. he gets sexually exploited in Texas because he didn't have a place to live, finds his way to Florida, still doesn't have an adult to live with, and starts looking for work. And he ends up working very long hours, and somebody who's constantly taking away, chipping away at that paycheck. And he also had to pay his smuggling debt. So there were several things that are going on here. Was the smuggler involved with the endpoint individual who ended up exploiting him? So you could have a context where the child is brought into the United States, they're smuggled into the United States, and then they end up being trafficked by somebody else. In this particular child's case, it was a sex trafficker because they were forcing him to provide sex in exchange for housing. And then afterwards, in a labor trafficking context, again, because he needed to find a safe place to live. And then the person who was caring for him was constantly forcing him to continue to work. So that's one context. The other context that we had was a minor who was seeking asylum from a home country where there was persecution, comes to the United States to live with a relative. And then the relative starts first extorting, I always say this word wrong, but extorting money from the parent in the home country, and using the child and telling the child to write these messages to the parent, for the parent to send more money and more money for payment of the attorney, for payment of school, and school was free here. So the parent in the home country is thinking one thing, and what's happening here in the United States is another. When there was no more money for the parents in the home country to send here, then it turned into a trafficking situation in the context of, now you need to work to be able to pay for your housing, to be able to pay for your immigration attorney, to be able to pay for the back taxes and the Social Security money that it's going to be owed. At some point, there was that threat too. And the child was 16, 17, and working in 4 and 5 different places like Burger King, Boston Market, McDonald's, Walgreens. The parental figure or the family member here gave that child the paperwork so that child could secure employment. So then you see, again, and the tactics were always this, more like in a domestic violence situation where there's an abusive relationship, but there's also the giving of love. So it's not always bad, right? There's this, I love you, and then I hurt you, and then I love you, and then I hurt you, that type of manipulation going on in that. So that's another example.
Thank you, Anna. Well, as they say, beware what you wish for. I want it more, and I can't get you to stop. But so thank you very much. That's really very much enlightening and useful. Let me come back to Caroline. Okay, Caroline, just as a matter of practice. So I know all of you mentioned here and there, but just so that we can have, rather than us to connect the dots, let me have you walk us step by step from the moment that a minor crosses the border in the United States. How do you deal with this minor? Can you just walk us through this journey, point A to A, B, C, D, whatever the final is? Would you do that for us?
Certainly, happy to connect the dots for all of us. So obviously the first step of identifying an unaccompanied child is an interaction with immigration officials. And I guess I would like to make the distinction that there are minors that will say that they are apprehended by, and that it wasn't necessarily exactly what they had wanted to be detected by immigration officials. And then there are also children who I think have some basic understanding of how the system works and who may say that they have turned themselves into immigration as well. So just to say that not every unaccompanied child is that was the goal when they first arrived to the United States, because I think that's an important distinction to make. As Ms. Bermudez alluded to, they can only stay within immigration detention for up to 72 hours as part of the Flores Settlement of 1997, which helps to set limits on length of time and conditions of detention for immigrant children. Those fall really into three sort of main points, in that they are expected to release children to family without any unnecessary delay. Children are expected to be placed in the least restrictive setting, and there are standards of care that are expected to be implemented while they are in custody. So after 72 hours at maximum, as a matter of practice currently, with the large numbers of unaccompanied children that we are seeing, I would say the length of stay is longer at this point, just because of the numbers and capacity within the shelters that are run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Children are spending more time in immigration detention. Once they are transferred to a shelter that's run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which, as mentioned, is housed within the Department of Health and Human Services, they receive, a variety of services while they are there. And this was all, this part of the system, I guess, was created as part of the Homeland Security Act of 2002, in which immigrant children, the custody of immigrant children was transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But while they're staying at these shelters, unaccompanied children receive medical services, educational services. There are assessments for risk and assessments completed at intake, which do include some questions for assessing for labor trafficking risk and sex trafficking risk. They have access to individual and group counseling, access to religious services, recreation, leisure, legal orientation, along with case management services. So it is a very comprehensive set of services. Again, as we've mentioned, the emergency intake sites or shelters, EIS sites, I would say that access to these services does look different. If you have one of the shelters that is typically run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, that is much smaller, and compared to the EIS sites, which can house up to 5,000 or 6,000 children, what that looks like can be very different. And there is a wide variety of structures for the shelters that are run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, from long-term foster care for children that have longer stays, trying to find that least restrictive option for them, to other shelter sites that are divided up typically by age and gender, all the way up to the EIS sites, which are quite large. As a matter of practice, the case management services are working to identify a family member or potentially a family friend. They don't necessarily have to be related to the minor, who will serve as a sponsor. So they have to go through an assessment themselves. They have to go through fingerprinting and a CAN check, child abuse and neglect check, in order to ensure that the placement is safe. And that is expected for all adults that are living in the home. Sponsors themselves do not have to have immigration status. I think that can sometimes be a somewhat common misconception. But a sponsor really can be any adult family member, from biological parent to grandparents, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, unverifiable family members, and family friends. During their stay, unaccompanied children can also be found to qualify for what's known as a home study. So that is essentially an assessment that, as part of my job, I also help to complete, which is evaluating the viability of a placement for a minor that potentially has been a victim of trafficking, a minor that has special needs, a minor that's been a victim of sexual or physical abuse, or if the sponsor presents a risk of abuse, maltreatment, exploitation, or trafficking. So in cases where those factors have been identified as part of the TVPRA, Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, it's a big name, they can qualify for a home study, which is a really comprehensive look at the home and interview of the minor, and just assessing their relationship and their capacity to provide for the minor's needs. And there are some additional other cases in which home studies can be requested as well. If a child is under the age of 12 and they're being released to a family friend or unverifiable relative, based on that relationship, they can be expected to complete the home study. And in cases where there are multiple sponsorships, particularly for unrelated family members, home studies will typically be requested to assess potentially for a risk of trafficking as well. So eventually, after that process has been completed, or if a minor doesn't qualify for a home study, they will be released to the sponsor. They can be provided what are called post-release services, which is the work that I do as a caseworker with unaccompanied children, along with the home studies. So depending on if they have been, or if they have completed a home study under TVPRA, they will have case management services with an agency like the International Rescue Committee, either until they turn 18 or they obtain legal immigration status. There are other cases where they will only receive services for a period of 3 months, during which time we're really just there to support with the transition and helping them to connect with services. So educational services, medical services, mental health, legal, and overall placement stability as well. So I think that is from point A to point
A, B, C, D.
I would say maybe to the end of the alphabet, but that's the process for an unaccompanied child.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for a really comprehensive answer to a very complicated issue. But thank you so much for sharing it. Let me turn to Mr. Piraino-Guzman, and I want to, in my mind was stuck what Caroline talked, one of the phrases she talked a lot about, so many issues important, but she talked about least restrictive options for children. And I want to connect this with your expertise. So you are a behavioral health analyst, and in your work, you are talking about the long-term effects of institutionalizing children who are seeking safety and protection. And also, I quote you, you talk about decriminalizing trauma. Can you share your thoughts about this with us, please?
Thank you. First, I'll say, Caroline, that was a great example, and it took me back to 2004 when the process, which tells me, right, like we need to continue to upgrade because it has been the same for so long. And when I think of decriminalizing trauma, I really look at the ways that the system, the people, our country, our society responds to people who have experienced trauma. In this case, as Anna gave many examples of children coming to the United States, that is not their first trauma. Like leaving their home country for a reason, for trauma. Taking this trip to the United States is a trauma. The things that happen to you throughout the process is a trauma. And then when we knock on the door seeking safety and protection, our system, our immigration system, it's not like our criminal justice system, right? Criminal justice system, sorry, my goodness, I forgot the first part of that. You're not guilty unless proven otherwise, right? But in our immigration system, it seems that we immediately take people out of that, incarcerate them and put them into facilities. We must understand that there isn't a system in our home countries, in Honduras, Salvador, Nicaragua. As far as I know, there isn't a system that is similar to what we see here. Having children stay with somebody else, or stay in an institution, a facility, whether if it is the ICE detention center or a facility where children. I don't know. I have worked at many actually of the facilities where children are at, Southwest Keys and other programs out here actually in Washington. Actually, I spent the last during the Trump administration, I spent a lot of time working at my side job there, so I can be with children. I wanted to provide that aspect because personally, firsthand, I know the long-term impact of the institutionalization of this aspect, right? After being taken from spending months in this facility, I was put in foster care. which just continue this aspect of trauma and being institutionalized, which changed my whole purview of how I interact with people, how I decided to have a family, when I decided to have family. And that is very important for us to acknowledge, because it goes back to the adverse childhood experiences the children experience from their home country to the place being in here. And yes, being at that facility is another adverse childhood experience. They're going to have a long-term effects of them. We also know that trauma will impact these children in such a way that the long term may have other impacts. I'm a survivor of human trafficking. I went through all this, my process, and I lost my ability to walk 8 months ago. So how do we, and I can actually pinpoint my trauma to my spinal issues. Actually, I was part of a research at the University of Utah that were looking at the aspect of trauma and the impact and the medical impact on people. And then we're seeing children, if we are able to follow children for 5 to 10 years after the release of from our facility, we're going to start seeing changes and the way, again, they interact with people, the way that they accept help, the way that they provide the support or help to others. It changes, it rewires us. We must acknowledge that. And to me, decriminalizing trauma, it really looks at us taking a different alternative to supporting these children and through the process of seeking safety. Reporting to law enforcement is not an easy process. And the law itself, it's a little difficult for children, especially those who experience labor trafficking, because those children have those extra elements to prove that they have experienced human trafficking by the force, fire, and coercion. But it goes back to also how do we talk about human trafficking in general, right? There is a moral issue of sex. And we have traditionally hyper-focused on sex trafficking because of the moral issue of sex. But then when it comes to labor trafficking, if you quest people, you will find out that a lot of people believe that labor trafficking only happens to immigrants, only happens to those people. So it doesn't impact the society at large because it's not sex trafficking. Or at least that is what we see, what we have heard in some of those places of the arguments for communities when we are talking about the subject of trauma and the impact that this threat happens to people. But I will tell you is that taking this trip to the United States is often a lot safer than being in our home country. And it is really hard to say. I left my mom, I left my brothers, I left everybody because my life is different, and I experienced a lot, and I just couldn't be there anymore. I had to find safety, and I had to find that safety as we defined it, as I individually defined it. Being in place in these facilities, we're going to have children. We are accumulating trauma on these children. If we look at the children who went to the zero tolerance policy, for example, and they were disconnected from parents, yet another trauma, then you're going to have children. We have seen children in the Pacific Northwest, for example, being diagnosed with reactive attachment disorders now, as far as when they are engaging with families. Again, another trauma. That is what we're talking about, trauma and the decriminalization of it. And the moment we take children, even from the border, and place them in these systems, then we are starting to rewire the brain in a way that that these children haven't seen. Yes, we live in trauma, but but we are used to trauma. Our country's trauma, but when it comes to institutions, we don't see it like that. We don't see facilities for children. We don't see it as a safety haven. We see it as an oppression, as a moment of like, I can't leave, right? Even though the door is open. I mean, I worked in a facility here in Seattle, the door is open, anybody could leave, but there's this sense of almost it makes me think of that power and control that takes place in human trafficking, on how children decide not to leave, or they can walk out the door if they want to, but there's the aspect of something stopping them, just like how people can leave their work in human trafficking. There's this aspect of where we can leave this place. So then again, creates this encapsulation for us, and then start producing trauma that the long term, these ACEs, this adverse childhood experience, are perhaps the it's like placing children on a golden platter for human trafficking. We talked a lot about sponsors and releasing children in the United States, and this is one of the things that I'm having a lot of challenges with accepting the fact between the sponsors and family, because I have seen children being released to sponsors and then being forced to work to pay their dues or their tickets or all those things they had to pay for to release the children. So we're creating another debt bondage by placing children in the hands of people who are not related to the children and who had to spend money to have those children released. So we need to start having those conversations, because we're creating a possible debt bondage situation for children.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really such an important issue to discuss. And as you said, it's important to have these conversations at length. And actually, I'm very happy that particularly in the more recent years, there is quite a lot of focus on the trauma-informed investigations and prosecutions as well. And here in my everywhere in the country, but in Miami-Dade County, particularly the state attorney's office and under the leadership of Catherine Fernandez-Rundle have been placing a lot of emphasis on the trauma issues and trauma-based investigations and prosecutions. But of course, trauma is so comprehensive to be dealt with, and impacts are absolutely incredible. Let me go back to Anna. Anna, is there a way, or what kind of benefits under the law could be there available for unaccompanied children that maybe could even help a little bit with mitigating this trauma and so on? And Mr. Piraino-Guzman mentioned it's such a complicated system per se, the legal system in itself. And but if you could add a few things.
So if we're talking about a child who is unaccompanied, who might be, or we might think that is a victim of trafficking, there are some mechanisms available to provide for assistance. The first step is to apply for an interim letter of eligibility to the Department of Health and Human Services. And sometimes this will happen if they are already being identified by the center or the placement, or if they happen to be in the system. This may be happening already. And that interim letter will give them benefits for 90 days and will allow the child to access, depending on what the programs are at the state level, but generally, they may be able to access medical screening, temporary assistance for needy families, Medicaid, state children health insurance, substance and mental abuse, mental health services, the SNAP program and other assistance like for needy children and families, and also some housing programs. After this 90-day letter of eligibility is issued, then the Department of Health and Human Services will supposedly in connection with the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice in consultation will determine whether this child could be eligible as a victim of human trafficking, and then reissue another letter that will let them continue receiving services, and which could also open up the door to receiving some services from the Unaccompanied Refugee Minors Program. And that letter is a letter of eligibility. So there's this interim letter that you apply for first, and to get initial services, and then there's a more an eligibility letter that is more permanent and could open the door for some of the unaccompanied refugee minors programs and housing programs in particular. Also, I wanted to, and we can, you can access the application online for the interim letter or for the letter of eligibility. And now it's done all on the Department of Health and Human Services Shepherd case management system. So you can do a Google search for that, or we can put in the link on the chat later on, and then after I finish talking. And then for purposes of immigration law, Cinia already mentioned, or Ms. Merbudes already mentioned, the special immigrant juvenile visa that's available, but there could also be a T visa available for that child if they're a victim of human trafficking. I believe Sumir's mentioned it. And there's also, if the child could be a victim of other crimes that may be investigated, they might be eligible for a U visa, or they might be eligible for asylum, which we've all kind of touched based on.
Thank you, Anna. And yeah, that all of these benefits are available, but of course it also needs the expertise of the people who will help to know that they exist and the way how to do it. So your work is really important. Caroline, I'll come back to you. And I know that we talked a little bit about the cultural dimensions in the work with unaccompanied minors, and Swami has already mentioned also this cultural element in the root causes. But from your experience, again, as a matter of practice with you as a caseworker, from your context with the clients and so on, what kind of barriers have you noticed, say culturally, linguistically, or any other barriers that you might have noticed? And do you have any ideas or any thoughts on how these can be overcome, or how we can work better to confront these challenges, these kind of barriers?
Yeah, certainly would be happy to talk about those topics. I mean, to start, just to acknowledge the vast linguistic diversity in countries, in Central America and beyond. I lived in Guatemala for 2.5 years before starting in my current role and working as a caseworker. And Guatemala has 25 recognized languages, 21 Mayan indigenous languages, and then Spanish, Chorti, Xinca, and Garifuna. So just to acknowledge, and that's just one example, but there are so many different languages, and access to interpretation really is so important, both in facilities and that need is sometimes met, and I think sometimes potentially not, and for a variety of reasons, but making sure that children have the opportunity to access that service and have the opportunity to really tell their story and be able to screen for those risks, and having access to them beyond release as well is incredibly important in ensuring that they can connect with those services appropriately. One topic that I think we've really touched on, I think, is sort of a root cause of some of the things that I see and regularly discuss with clients is sort of this idea that UC's unaccompanied children typically have is being providers. I think for a lot of them, because of trauma they may have faced in situations where they had to provide for themselves, they really feel already somewhat like adults. For many of them, they've worked for many years. They may have been out of school for many years as well. And I think that sort of perception of themselves that they have taken on while living in home country can kind of feel like it's being stripped away a little bit while they're here. I think, we've talked about, the desire to work and not having legal work authorization. I think for a lot of them feels very restrictive. They have needs that need to be met. They have people that they want to provide for. They have family members that they want to be able to support. That initially what's told is, or the information that we're giving them is that could have negative consequences in their immigration case. And I think that for them is very difficult. Even beyond 18, I think a lot of them are thinking about those options really carefully and really wanting to be able to have some level of independence, and that independence they maybe had before, and they don't necessarily have that in this system. I think one of the other things that we talk a lot about too is that many unaccompanied children have experienced significant interrupted formal education. I would say an average level of academic attainment would probably be the 6th grade and finishing primary school. And at least where I am in our area, if a child is 15, 16, or 17 and looking to enroll in high school but doesn't have proof of past studies, they'll be enrolled in 9th grade. With kids that are much younger and don't have the same lived experiences, who maybe are better academically prepared because they haven't experienced that significant interruption in formal education, and obviously know the education system here better, just from having been a part of it for a longer period of time. And then you think about the language barrier as well. And I think that education, if you think about where children receive a large amount of socialization, I think school can in some ways feel a bit isolating for students. So some effective ways in New York City, I feel very lucky in that we have a lot of options for schools. We have international high schools that have classes for newcomers, where they are with other students that also are largely Spanish speaking. There's a school in South Brooklyn that has a newcomer class of 12 with 11 students from Guatemala, many of whom are able to speak their Mayan indigenous language with other students in the class, which is, not something I maybe even expected, but it's a really, I think, encouraging experience for them to be amongst peers and to be able to have those social interactions. So I know that's a really effective way, is making sure that they have access to their teacher that speaks Spanish and has access to interpretation services, and they have, again, those peers and that interaction with other minors that maybe are in somewhat of a similar situation as well, to be able to support them. So those are some of the things I think school and work are two of the biggest topics that we discuss regularly. I think another thing that we see often is there's somewhat of a honeymoon period, is what we call it, with reunification with the sponsor, where something potentially they've wanted for a very long time and something that they've sought out. And, after a long period of separation, it can be really difficult to go through the process of reunifying with a parent or, an older sibling that they haven't seen for several years. So sort of mitigating that process and helping them to come to those mutual understandings in a way that's beneficial for the child is, something that we often address as well.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for this absolutely detailed answer to a really complicated issue to deal with, but also that brings the vulnerability, the increased vulnerability of children that are vulnerable just by their own age and by the fact that are unaccompanied, and children crossing the borders alone is enough. But there are so many more vulnerabilities that if we stop and think carefully, and so on, listening to people like you that are working with them is absolutely empowering for us that want to do this work. And let me go to Suarez about talking about vulnerability. So let's just build on a little bit on what Caroline was talking about. And you all discussed about all these vulnerabilities, but is there a way that we can help reduce these vulnerabilities of children, and or how we can help at least to mitigate it? And if you have any suggestions, having been yourself in the system, maybe you have some personal suggestions as well. How can the system be better?
Thank you. I think that is the right question to ask. Like, how can the system be better? How can we move forward? How can we evolve from Reno versus Flores? How can we evolve to really thinking about the children as people who are seeking safety, refuge, and provide them with the right status? I think if we start looking behind the full picture of the reasons why children migrate to the United States, we'll find a lot of elements that could potentially make them eligible for SIJS, which I also got SIJS, and that's actually how I was able to turn my T visa into a green card right away, given that I had that aspect. So I believe that we need a societal change in mind and perhaps a little bit of a heart in it, when it comes to children, right? It's the social justice and social inclusion. It's the current. It's honestly what we're going through in this country right now, where there are the calls for change, and those calls for change and the society change, it must include unaccompanied children, as we see these children are not only vulnerable to human trafficking, but vulnerable to other types of abuse, and also just future victimization. And I always like to say I am working on ensuring equity so we can all I'm working on ensuring equity so we can all enjoy equality. And that is exactly what we need for these children. We need equity. We need to provide them with the right systems of support that they need. And I think our country has gone through this process of anti-immigrant sentiment that has really, despite being children who are seeking safety and protection, we are automatically penalizing them for the act of seeking safety, both by the law and by society, by perhaps not by all society, but by members of society that are casting this shadow on how these children should be seen. And I'm all for having people having their own perspective, but I would challenge anybody to think: is this the way you want your child to be treated in Honduras, Salvador, or other places? If your child had to go to the same thing, if I was your child, your daughter, your son, what would you do? Would you actually push for such to change? Put yourself in that shoes, right? As a parent, I have a 2-year-old. You can see right there. Well, 1.5. He looks like 2. It's really it's important for us to understand these and to know that these are children. The system is also is an interesting system. I was a very big kid, a tall kid, so they had to do like teeth exam. Like they also had to do my risk exam to prove that I was a minor, because the system is against me. I had to prove that I myself was a minor, even though I look big. So I think that at society level, we need social justice to understand that these children are looking for justice, and unfortunately, our countries cannot give us justice. I was actually, the first time that I was sexually abused was 12 years old. I literally faced my abuser in court. My abuser walked out of court because I was a boy, saying that a man had abused me. And it was really difficult. So our society needs to understand that these are the root causes to why we're coming here. We don't come to take anything away, yet we're coming here to contribute our best possible ways. And I mean, we have seen, at DACA youth, just represented the United States at the Olympics, we can become just amazing things for our country, for our society, for these people, to contribute to the place that give us safety and protection. And that is what we want to do. Please don't, I ask for grace as I say this, because I have always said this. We don't want to be tax takers. We want to be taxpayers. And that's the thing, like we keep putting those two together. The immigrants are taking our tax, and it's really not right. But I do see that there are protections, there are services that are offered to us that we need to start considering offering those to children a lot sooner, right? Whether if it is the eligibility letter at the Department of Health and Human Services Agency, or if you ask me, we will need a whole halt of the system and actually sees children as refugees, as people seeking asylum, because if you start peeling those layers, you will find those elements you need. That's my alarm, my 5 minutes. But just to close that comment, I invite our society, our country, our systems to start peeling those layers and start asking the right question. What do you need? Why are you here? What happened to you? Let's move away to what's wrong with you. Why are you here? To what happened to you, and what happened to you that you had to do this to find safety. If we just reframe this from a trauma to a trauma-informed perspective, we will find the answers that we need to actually change society's mind about children who are coming seeking safety, but also find them, give them the access to equity justice that they need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You bring up some really very important issues, social justice issues, human rights issues, rule of law because of the safety and everything, because these are really the problems that have to be dealt with in countries of origin as well as here and everywhere. And states and governments have obligations towards accomplishing these tasks. And you also asked us, the audience, and everyone, hypothetically, put yourself in the position, what would you do if you were your child? Now, for the last question, for the couple of minutes that we are left, I want to go to Senia and have Senia help us what we can do, what we, the audience, what would you suggest that we can do to advocate vis-a-vis this problem that all of you helped us get so much information about?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. So there's lots of ways, especially if you're here in the United States, to get involved to help with this issue. One, of course, is if you are interested in being a sponsor for these children after they are released from or our custody. A lot of them, if you're eligible, a lot of them are seeking homes, whether they be foster care or permanent adoption. Unfortunately, not all have family members here in the United States that can take care of them. I have clients who are in foster care facilities because they don't have any family here in the States. So if you are willing to open your heart and home, that's one way to do it. But an even more basic step, and I'm going to take a little step back for those of you who are not familiar with US law, in letting you know that Congress ultimately has control over immigration laws. Executive branch can do only so much, but ultimately the power rests with Congress as to who can stay in the United States. They're the ones who determine who's eligible for asylum, how many visas, for example, are allotted to be special immigrant juvenile status, how many T visas are available, how many people can apply for their T visa, from T visas to their adjustment, and same thing for SIJs. I will talk a little bit more about the SIJs aspect because there is a huge backlog with SIJs, not only with getting the actual petition approved, but majority of these unaccompanied minors who come into the United States are from the Northern Triangle, from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. There is a huge backlog of available green cards, of available visas for these children from these countries. Congress is very strangely put these children who have approved SIJs petitions in the employment-based category for immigration green cards. I don't fully understand why, but there is a limit. They slightly increased the limit, but since the surge in 2014, there has been a backlog. I have, for example, a client that my predecessor applied for the SIJs for back in 2018. It was approved in 2019, which is somewhat short of a period for SIJs, but I was only able to apply for his green card last week because of the backlog. So he's been waiting essentially almost 2 years for his priority date to be current. So there needs to be an increase in the cap of available visas for these children. They're in the interim between their SIJs being approved and them getting a green card, their permanent residency, sorry, I keep saying green card, but their permanent legal residency. They can't apply for work authorization. We've tried under different categories, they're not eligible. We keep getting denied work authorization for them. So getting Congress to increase these caps, not only for SIJs, but for the T visas, that's a huge step. We need immigration reform badly in this country. I know I'm running out of time, but there is one more update on, or one more thing that can be done. There has been proposed changes to the Flora settlement. Many of my colleagues have spoken about the Flora settlement and sort of how, not revolutionary it's been, but how necessary it is. And not even just that, but the fact that more needs to be done beyond the Flora settlement agreement. There are changes to strip the Flores Settlement Agreement of its protection of unaccompanied minors. It gives the Department of Health and Human Services the discretion to strip children of the unaccompanied child status, which would then strip them of all the protections associated with that status that I mentioned earlier. It will allow them to be held in CBP ICE detention for only a limited amount of time. So there is a sign-on that is actually ending today. If you are interested in putting your name on it, I will put the link in the chat so that you can sign on to prevent these changes from taking place.
Thank you. Wow. Time flies and we don't have any more time left for this time, but we hope to see everyone soon. Let me start by, in closing, let me start by thanking the audience. Thank you so very much for joining us from all over the world, from all over the United States and above all, thank you for the extraordinary work that you do in the stations that you work with migrants, refugees, unaccompanied children. On your behalf, on behalf of the audience, I want to, and on behalf of St. Thomas University, School of Law, John J. Brunetti Human Trafficking Academy and its Human Rights Program, I want to thank our esteemed panelists. It was a very illuminating discussion. We hope to have you back for a lengthier time so that we really need to benefit from your knowledge, expertise, and experience that you so graciously have shared with us. We have been blessed to have you today with us. I want to thank again our co-sponsors, the IRC, IRC Florida, particularly Miami, even more so, and the South Florida Task Force for working together with us in putting this program together. And I also want to thank the DCF for the work that they do. They had been invited, and I understand because of the very busy schedule that they have, as you understand, even with unaccompanied minors, they were not able to join us, but we do appreciate the work that they do. Now, we have continuing legal education credits coming up for this event, those lawyers in the audience. We will let you know once we have it, those of Florida, of course, but for the lawyers that are not from Florida, you'll have to check whether they grant, there is reciprocity in order for these, for the recognition of these CLEs. And finally, stay tuned with us with the John J. Brunetti Human Trafficking Academy. We have several events coming up very soon in September 26th, which is the Vatican's Day, 107th World Day of Migrants and Refugees. We are focusing on the theme of Greater We, which is a discussion that many of you brought up today. So I hope you will join us again for that. And our certificate program, our Human Trafficking Academy, will run from October 18 to November 1st. Stay tuned on our website. We also have your emails. We'll let you know. And again, many thanks. Thank you to our panelists. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Have a fabulous weekend. And may God bless you always. Thank you.